When I was stranded in the Maldives with no passport, I received a frantic message from my grandfather's lawyer telling me to fly home immediately and not tell my parents. At the Atlanta airport, federal marshals were waiting for me, and after I saw the stolen bank records, I lost consciousness. The harsh fluorescent lights of the Atlanta airport medical room burned through my closed eyelids. The sharp smell of rubbing alcohol filled my lungs. I opened my eyes to the sound of heavy paper slamming against a metal table. Attorney Harrison stood over my cot. His face was grim. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not offer me water. He simply pushed a thick stack of banking records directly onto my lap. Look at page 4. Layla. Your family did not invite you to the Maldives to heal old wounds. They invited you there to erase you. I sat up. The room spun slightly, but my training as a forensic auditor immediately kicked in. I grabbed the heavy file. The numbers stared back at me. Columns of offshore transfers, wire routing codes linking back to my father, Reginald and his massive real estate empire. I turned to page 4. It was a police report stamped and certified from 19 years ago. It stated I had run away from home at age 13, declaring me a missing endangered runaway. The ultimate betrayal. I stared at the signature at the bottom of the police report. It belonged to my mother, Corinne, the woman who handed me a mimosa on the beach 48 hours ago. The woman who secretly rummaged through my luggage, stole my passport, and left me stranded thousands of miles away. They left you there so you could not make it back to American soil today, Harrison said. They calculated flight times, knowing an emergency passport takes 3 days. They wanted you stuck in the Indian Ocean. The memory of being 13 years old hit me like a physical blow. I remembered the biting cold of that December night. Reginald grabbed the collar of my thin jacket and threw me out the front door of our luxury estate. He stood on the porch in his tailored suit, looking down with pure hatred. He called me trash, claiming I did not fit the pristine image of his congregation. I was a stain on his pastoral reputation and his real estate empire. I shivered in the snow, begging Corinne to let me back inside. She just closed the heavy oak door. The very next morning, they filed this false runaway report. Why? The word barely escaped my throat. I looked at Harrison. I survived on my own. Building a career liquidating massively corrupt companies, I have not asked them for a single dime in 18 years. Why invite me on a vacation just to trap me? Harrison tapped a highlighted clause. Because of your grandfather, he despised Reginald, knowing he used the church as a front for his greed. Before dying, he bypassed your mother, setting up an irrevocable trust fund, solely in your name. $50 million. Layla, $50 million, sitting in a high-yield account, gathering interest for 18 years. My breath caught $50 million. My late grandfather had finally left me a fortune, but there is a stipulation. Harrison continued tracing the legal jargon. The trust activates on your 32nd birthday. You must claim it in person on United States soil. If you fail to present yourself to the trustees by midnight tonight, the entire $50 million defaults to the secondary beneficiary. I already knew the secondary beneficiary was my older sister Giselle, the golden child, the one who got the brand new cars, the designer bags, and the vice president title at my father's company. Giselle, who married Preston, a broke white man looking for a free ride. Reginald and Corinne declared you a runaway, so they could assume emergency guardianship over the trust interest, Harrison explained. They have been siphoning the interest for 18 years to fund their megachurch and their lavish lifestyle. But they could not touch the principal $50 million, not until tonight. If you are not sitting in my office by midnight, tonight, the money legally transfers to Giselle, and Preston will make sure that money is instantly wired into their joint accounts. They needed you trapped overseas today. The sheer scale of the manipulation was suffocating. Every fake smile on that vacation, every toast to family unity. It was all a calculated performance to keep me away from my own inheritance. They had smiled in my face while actively plotting to steal my future. I looked up at the wall clock. It was 5 in the evening. My 32nd birthday ended in exactly 7 hours. "We need to leave for my office immediately," Layla Harrison said, reaching for my arm. "We have to secure the trust before Reginald lands." I pulled my arm back. The dizzy feeling was completely gone. The scared 13-year-old girl shivering in the snow was dead. I looked at the bank records one more time. I saw the fragile house of cards Reginald had built using my stolen identity. I saw exactly how to dismantle it. "We are not going to your office, Harrison," I said, my voice dangerously calm. I packed 2 passports for this trip because my forensic auditing work requires constant international travel and extreme caution. They stole my personal passport, but they missed my corporate one. I caught a flight 12 hours before them. They think I am crying on a beach right now, begging for help. I stood up and grabbed my laptop bag. "Where are we going then?" Harrison asked, looking confused. I checked the flight tracking app on my phone. "To the international arrival gate," I replied. "My family lands in exactly 15 minutes, and I am going to give them the exact welcome home they truly deserve now." My phone vibrated violently against the cold metal of the medical room table. The harsh buzzing sound pulled my attention away from the terminal map on my screen. I picked up the device and saw a notification from the family group chat. It was a message from Preston. He was my sister Giselle and her husband. Preston was a white man from a supposedly wealthy family who had married into our prominent African-American church dynasty. In reality, he was nothing but a broke opportunist who attached himself to my sister for access to my father's wealth. I opened the message and felt a cold wave of disgust wash over me. Preston had sent a photo of himself and Giselle clinking crystal champagne flutes in the first-class cabin of their flight. Underneath the photo, his text read exactly like the smug coward he was. "Enjoy starving on that cheap public beach, Layla. The local police said they cannot verify your identity, so you are stuck there for at least a week. Do not expect anyone here to pay for your ticket home. Your father says failures need to learn how to survive on their own. We are flying back to Atlanta in style. Good luck finding a meal tonight." I stared at the screen. My own family had left me to rot on an island thousands of miles away, and my arrogant brother-in-law was treating my misery like a joke. He actually thought I was sitting in the sand crying over my lost passport. He had no idea I was sitting just 2 terminals away from his arrival gate, armed with forensic auditing software that could dismantle his entire existence. I did not reply to his text. Instead, I unzipped my leather bag and pulled out my laptop. I set it on the medical examination bed and powered it up. Harrison watched me with a tight expression. "What are you doing, Layla?" he asked. "I thought we were going to the arrival gate to meet them. We have 15 minutes until they disembark," I replied. My fingers flew across the keyboard. That is exactly 14 minutes more than I need to see exactly what they have been hiding. As a corporate liquidator, I spent my days breaking through heavy encryption to find hidden assets of corrupt billionaires. My parents' security protocols were an absolute joke compared to what I usually handled. I launched my decryption software and targeted the cloud drive for my father's megachurch empire. The screen flashed as lines of code bypassed their basic passwords. Within 90 seconds, I was inside the private financial servers of the Atlanta elite megachurch my father had built. I opened the master ledger and started filtering the transactions by date. I scrolled all the way back to December 19th, 19 years ago. That was the exact day my life ended and their empire began. The glow of the laptop screen illuminated the dark corners of my memory. I closed my eyes for a fraction of a second, and I was 13 years old again. I could feel the biting winter wind slicing through my thin cotton pajamas. I remembered standing barefoot on the frozen concrete of our driveway. My father, Reginald, stood on the massive front porch of our luxury estate. He wore a tailored wool suit and a gold watch that caught the porch light. He pointed a heavy finger at my face and told me I was a worthless piece of trash. He said my rebellious nature was a stain on his holy pastoral brand. He told me I did not belong in his pristine, wealthy family. My mother Corinne stood right behind him. She wore a silk robe and held a mug of hot tea. I had begged her to let me inside. I told her my feet were going numb from the freezing snow. She simply took a sip of her tea and closed the heavy oak door in my face, locking the deadbolt. I had walked 5 miles in the snow to a gas station that night. I thought they hated me because I was not perfect like Giselle. I thought I was truly a failure. I opened my eyes and looked at the spreadsheets on my screen. The truth was far more sinister than simple hatred. On December 20th, the very morning after they threw me into the freezing snow, my mother filed a police report declaring me a missing runaway. That police report triggered an emergency guardianship clause in my late grandfather's trust. My grandfather had known my father was a greedy fraud. He intentionally bypassed my parents and left his entire $50 million fortune to me. But by legally declaring me a runaway minor, my parents gained temporary control over the interest generated by that trust. I traced the routing numbers on the screen. For 18 years, they never touched the principal $50 million because the law forbade it. But the interest on $50 million in a high-yield, aggressive investment account was massive. I watched the flow of money moving through offshore shell companies. Millions of dollars of interest legally belonging to me had been siphoned out every single quarter. I looked at the exact amounts transferred to their personal holding companies. 200,000 here and 400,000 there. Where did it go? I muttered, clicking through the final layer of offshore accounts. I gasped as the final destination loaded on my screen. The money did not just buy them luxury cars and designer clothes, it funded the megachurch. Every single brick of Reginald and Corinne's massive cathedral in Atlanta was paid for by my stolen interest. The stained glass windows, the broadcast equipment, the community center, the political donations. His entire reputation as a powerful real estate mogul and holy pastor was financed by the money he stole from the 13-year-old girl he left to freeze in the snow. They built a kingdom on my stolen identity. They played the role of the pious wealthy elite while secretly bleeding my trust dry. And Preston, my arrogant white brother-in-law, was sitting in first class, drinking champagne bought with my money. He thought he was untouchable because he married into a wealthy black dynasty. He did not realize the dynasty was entirely fake and built on my suffering. He thought he was so smart marrying Giselle to fix his own bankrupt family legacy. I downloaded the entire ledger onto a secure encrypted flash drive. The downloading progress bar filled up with a satisfying green color. I pulled the drive out and slipped it into my jacket pocket. I closed the laptop and placed it back into my bag. The fear and confusion I felt earlier were completely gone. The sadness of that freezing night was replaced by a burning, clinical focus. My family thought they had successfully trapped me overseas until midnight to claim the remaining $50 million. They thought they had won the ultimate prize. I turned to Harrison. He was staring at me with a mix of awe and concern. "The transfer is complete," I said. "I have every bank statement, every offshore routing number, and every fraudulent tax return my father ever filed. My family is not just morally bankrupt. They are legally exposed and completely vulnerable." I grabbed my bag and walked toward the medical room door. "Let us go to the arrival gate, Harrison. The first-class passengers always disembark first. I would hate to keep Preston and my loving parents waiting." Harrison grabbed my arm as I slung the laptop bag over my shoulder. He told me to stop and think about this logically. He said the federal marshals were already waiting in the security office just down the hall. He wanted to signal them to move in and arrest my family the second they stepped off the jet bridge. He argued that the wire fraud and identity theft evidence on my flash drive was more than enough to put Reginald and Corinne in federal prison for the rest of their natural lives. He pleaded with me to let law enforcement handle it quietly and cleanly in a private airport interrogation room. I pulled my arm away from his grip. I looked him dead in the eye and told him that a quiet arrest was a mercy they did not deserve. I told him that my parents did not destroy my life quietly in a back room. They threw me out into the freezing snow and then spent 18 years publicly parading around Atlanta as the ultimate holy family. They built a massive empire on my stolen identity, and they needed to watch that empire crumble in front of the very people they lied to. I walked out of the medical room, and Harrison followed closely behind me. We navigated through the bright, sterile corridors of the Atlanta airport, heading straight for Terminal E. As we walked, I explained the reality of my father's public image. Reginald was not just a successful businessman, he was a bishop. He was the most powerful pastor in the elite African American community of Atlanta. Every Sunday, he stood at a custom acrylic pulpit, wearing custom silk suits, preaching to thousands of devoted followers. He wrote best-selling books about family values and raising righteous children. He sat on the boards of local charities and hosted massive galas to raise money for community development. Corinne was right beside him, leading the women's ministry. She hosted televised prayer breakfasts where she preached about maternal love and divine forgiveness. The hypocrisy was sickening. Giselle sat on the board of directors for the church charity fund. She used the congregation donations to fund her luxury shopping habits, while Preston acted as the chief financial advisor. Preston used his white corporate background to give the church an air of legitimate business operations for their wealthy external donors. They were a perfectly coordinated crime syndicate hiding behind stained glass and gospel music. His congregation looked at him as a beacon of generational wealth and black excellence. They trusted him implicitly. They gave him their tithes and their absolute devotion. But behind the holy facade, Reginald was nothing but a parasite. I explained to Harrison how the forensic audit revealed the truth about my father's real estate empire. The sprawling megachurch campus, the luxury housing developments, the commercial shopping centers in downtown Atlanta. None of it was actually his. He had used his emergency guardianship over my stolen identity to pledge my trust fund interest as collateral. Every single loan he took out to build his empire was tied directly to my social security number. His entire life was a fragile house of cards built on the back of the 13-year-old girl he threw away. We reached the federal security office near the international arrivals gate. Two federal marshals in dark suits stepped out to meet us. They had received the briefing from Harrison earlier that day. The taller marshal nodded at me and said they were ready to intercept the family at the customs checkpoint. I shook my head and told the marshals to stand down. I instructed them to stay out of sight and follow my lead. I told them I did not want my family arrested at the airport. I wanted them to feel safe. I wanted them to think their malicious plan had worked perfectly. The marshals looked at Harrison for confirmation. Harrison sighed and gave them a subtle nod, indicating that I was the victim and they should follow my instructions. I detailed my strategy to the officers. I wanted to escort my family to the annual charity gala Reginald was hosting tonight. It was the biggest social event of the year for the Atlanta elite. I knew my parents would be rushing straight from the airport to the country club to make their grand entrance. I wanted the marshals to surround the perimeter of the gala and wait for my signal. I wanted my family to be surrounded by their wealthy peers when the truth finally dropped. We walked out of the security office and positioned ourselves behind a massive concrete pillar near the international baggage claim. The area was bustling with exhausted travelers and expectant families holding welcome signs. I stared up at the giant digital arrival board suspended from the ceiling. The bright blue letters illuminated the terminal. The flight connecting from Dubai carrying passengers from the Maldives was listed on the third row. The status glowed in bright yellow letters indicating it was delayed. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was the physical manifestation of my anxiety trying to break through my clinical focus. I forced myself to breathe deeply and steady my hands. The air conditioning in the terminal felt exactly like the freezing wind from that December night 19 years ago. But this time, I was not a helpless child freezing on a porch. I was burning with absolute purpose. For 18 years, I had been a ghost to them. I had been a discarded problem they thought they solved with a fake police report and a locked door. Today, they left me on a tropical island with no passport, believing they had secured $50 million. They had spent the last 20 hours flying in first-class luxury, toasting to their successful theft. They thought they had finally won the ultimate prize. I watched the digital board intensely. The yellow delayed status flickered and vanished. The screen refreshed, and bright green letters appeared next to the flight number. Landed. The word sent a shockwave of adrenaline straight to my core. They were here. Reginald, Corinne, Giselle, and Preston were currently walking through the jet bridge, completely unaware that the daughter they tried to erase was standing just a few hundred feet away, holding the absolute destruction of their entire lives. Harrison stood next to me and checked his watch. He whispered that they would be coming through the VIP customs channel any minute now. I nodded and stepped slightly further into the shadow of the concrete pillar. I clutched the strap of my laptop bag, feeling the hard shape of the encrypted flash drive in my pocket. The trap was set, and the prey was walking blindly right into it. I kept my eyes glued to the frosted glass doors of the VIP arrival gate, waiting for the first glimpse of the people who broke my heart so many years ago. The frosted glass doors of the VIP arrival gate slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. My father Reginald led the pack. He walked with the heavy, confident stride of a man who believed he owned the very ground he stepped on. He wore a custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than the average congregation member made in a year. His booming pastoral laugh echoed across the polished terminal floor. Next to him, my mother Corinne strutted like runway royalty. She was draped in a pristine white cashmere coat, clutching a limited-edition crocodile skin Birkin bag that screamed new money. Right behind them, my sister Giselle walked arm in arm with her husband Preston. Giselle was wearing oversized Chanel sunglasses indoors, actively complaining to Preston about the quality of the champagne in first class. Preston threw his head back and laughed loudly. "It is still better than whatever tap water Vivian is drinking on that public beach right now." Preston chuckled loudly enough for passing travelers to hear. "Do you think she figured out her passport is missing yet?" Giselle giggled and adjusted her diamond necklace. "Who cares, Preston? Let her rot in the sand. By the time she finds a consulate to issue an emergency replacement, we will be counting the $50 million. God is so good." Reginald turned around and beamed at his son-in-law. "The Lord always rewards the righteous, Preston. That money was meant to build our sanctuary and expand our holy footprint. Leaving Vivian behind was simply divine intervention. We are officially in the clear." They were so wrapped up in their arrogant celebration that they did not even look up as they approached my location. I took a slow, deep breath. I let the burning clinical focus take over my entire body. I stepped out from the shadow of the massive concrete pillar and planted my feet directly in the center of their path. I stood perfectly still. "Welcome back to Atlanta," I said. My voice was completely flat, cutting through their laughter like a razor blade. The physical shock that hit my family was something I will savor for the rest of my life. It was a spectacular, simultaneous collapse of their arrogant posture. Giselle literally stumbled backward, tripping over her own designer heels. She grabbed Preston's arm to steady herself, her jaw dropping so fast she looked comical. The smug smile on Preston's face vanished instantly, entirely replaced by a sickly pale shade of panic. He stared at me as if a ghost had just materialized from the airport floor. Corinne froze, completely rigid. Her perfectly manicured fingers lost their grip on the handle of her Birkin bag. The bag slipped down her arm and hit the floor with a heavy thud. She ripped her designer sunglasses off her face, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. Reginald was the only one who did not step back. The shock on his face lasted for exactly 3 seconds before the deep, ingrained narcissism took over. His eyes darted around the busy terminal, assessing the crowd before snapping back to me. His face contorted into a mask of aggressive irritation. He immediately reverted to the exact same manipulation tactics he used when I was a helpless child. He puffed out his chest, trying to use his physical size and booming voice to intimidate me. "How did you get here?" Reginald demanded. His voice was a harsh, aggressive whisper. He took a threatening step forward, trying to invade my personal space. "Corinne assured me that your documents were secured in her luggage. How did you get on a plane, Vivian?" I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked right past his expensive suit and saw the pathetic thief hiding underneath. I always travel with a secondary corporate passport for my forensic auditing firm, I replied smoothly. A habit I picked up because I learned early in life that relying on family is a fast track to ruin. Reginald scoffed, waving his hand in the air as if my presence was nothing more than a minor annoyance. He pointed a heavy gold-ringed finger at the massive pile of luxury luggage sitting on the VIP baggage carousel behind me. I do not care how you got here, Vivian, he snapped. Since you decided to stalk us at the airport, you can at least make yourself useful. Grab the heavy trunks. Your mother is exhausted from the flight. Bring them to the limousine waiting outside, and do not make a scene. We have a charity gala to prepare for, and I will not let your usual dramatic behavior ruin our evening. It was a classic Reginald tactic. Treat the victim like a servant. Demean them in public to assert dominance. Reduce them to the frightened 13-year-old girl who used to beg for his approval. He expected me to lower my eyes and grab the handles of his Louis Vuitton trunks. He expected me to shrink back into the role of the worthless scapegoat. I stood my ground. I looked at the mountain of designer luggage and then stared directly into my father's eyes. I carried my own bags when you threw me into the snow in the middle of the night, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the terminal. I dragged my own belongings down an icy driveway, while you stood on the porch and told me I was garbage. I certainly will not be carrying yours. Reginald stiffened. The veins in his neck began to bulge against his silk collar. Do not speak to your father that way, you ungrateful brat. Corinne hissed, stepping forward to join the attack. You always do this. You always try to ruin our happiness. We gave you everything, and you threw it away. You are an embarrassment to this family and to our church. You gave me nothing. Corinne? I fired back, stepping closer to her. The smell of her expensive perfume could not mask the stench of her lies. You filed a false missing persons report the morning after you kicked me out. You legally declared me a runaway so you could hijack the emergency guardianship clause of grandfather's trust. Every designer coat you are wearing, every diamond on Giselle's neck, every first-class ticket you bought for this flight was paid for with the interest stolen from my account. The air between us turned electric. Travelers walking past began to slow down, turning their heads to watch the well-dressed family arguing in the middle of the terminal. The realization that I knew exactly how they funded their empire hit Reginald hard. His hands balled into tight fists. The holy pastor facade was cracking rapidly under the fluorescent airport lights. Corinne realized that Reginald was losing control of the situation. She stepped in front of him, her perfectly manicured fingernails pointing right at my face, ready to unleash a hysterical performance for the gathering crowd. Corinne threw her hands up into the air and let out a piercing theatrical shriek that echoed off the high vaulted ceilings of the terminal. She staggered backward, pressing the back of her hand against her forehead like a swooning actress in a cheap soap opera. "Help us, please! Somebody help us!" she wailed, her voice carrying over the noise of the busy baggage claim. She pointed a trembling manicured finger right at my chest, her diamond rings catching the harsh airport lighting. "This woman is insane. She is stalking us. My own estranged daughter has lost her mind, and she is harassing our family." She looked around at the growing crowd of travelers who had stopped pulling their luggage to stare at the wealthy family, having a meltdown in the middle of Terminal E. She locked eyes with two airport security guards who were rushing over their hands, hovering near their radios. "Please, officers, you have to arrest her," Corinne cried, forcing fake tears to well up in her eyes. "She is deeply mentally unstable. She ran away from home years ago, and now she follows us everywhere, demanding money. We do not feel safe. We just got off a 20-hour flight, and she is threatening my husband and my children. You need to remove her immediately." The two security guards pushed their way through the circle of onlookers, looking tense and serious. They stepped between me and my parents, holding their hands out to create a physical barrier. You need to step back and lower your voice," one of the guards said, looking at me with a stern expression. "If you are harassing these passengers, we are going to have to detain you and call the local police." Reginald stood behind the guards looking incredibly smug. He adjusted the lapels of his custom charcoal suit and gave me a look of pure triumphant superiority. He thought his wife had successfully flipped the script. He thought they had won again, just like they did 19 years ago. I did not step back. I did not raise my voice. I did not act like the hysterical crazy woman Corinne was desperately trying to portray me as I simply reached into my leather laptop bag. I moved slowly and deliberately, making sure the guards could see exactly what I was doing. My fingers brushed past the encrypted flash drive and closed around a thick folded piece of heavy stock paper. I pulled it out and held it up under the bright fluorescent lights. "What is that?" the security guard asked, his hand dropping away from his radio. I unfolded the paper and flattened it out, so the official state seals and the notarized stamps were clearly visible. "This is a certified copy of a missing persons report filed 19 years ago in Fulton County," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "It was filed by that woman crying. Fake tears behind you. Corinne Wilson, the wife of the esteemed bishop. Reginald Wilson. I want everyone here to listen very closely to the lies she told the police to steal my identity." I cleared my throat and began reading the exact words Corinne had written on that cold December morning. My daughter Vivian ran away in the middle of the night. She took cash from my purse and packed a bag. She has a long history of violent, unpredictable outbursts and severe mental instability. We fear for her safety and the safety of others. She has completely severed ties with our loving family and refuses to submit to our parental guidance. I looked up from the paper and stared directly into Corinne's wide, terrified eyes. She filed this report 12 hours after my father dragged me by the collar of my pajamas and threw me into a blizzard, locking the doors behind me. The crowd of onlookers gasped, murmuring among themselves as the reality of my words settled over the terminal. The security guards looked at each other, unsure of how to handle a family dispute involving decades-old police reports and allegations of massive fraud. Corinne's face drained of all color. Her fake tears stopped, instantly replaced by a stark white mask of absolute panic. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. She looked like a fish suffocating on dry land. Reginald grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises, trying to pull her behind him, but she was frozen. The elegant white cashmere coat she wore suddenly looked too big for her trembling frame. "That is a fake," she finally stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "She is lying. That paper is a forgery. We loved her. We gave her a beautiful home. She is just a pathological liar, making up stories to extort us because we are wealthy and successful." She could not even maintain eye contact with the security guards as she stumbled through her pathetic denial. She was crumbling under the weight of her own documented lies. That was when Giselle decided to step in. She pushed past Preston and stomped right up to the security guards. Her face twisted into an ugly snarl of pure entitlement. "You are nothing but a jealous loser, Vivian," Giselle screamed, pointing her designer handbag at my face. "You have always been obsessed with us. You are just mad because Daddy built an empire. And you got left behind in the dirt. Look at you. You are pathetic. Standing in an airport reading ancient pieces of paper, trying to ruin our lives. Because you have nothing of your own. We are rich. We are powerful. We do important work for the church and the community. And you are just a bitter little nobody trying to get a payout. You want our money so badly, it is making you crazy." Giselle tossed her hair over her shoulder and glared at me with pure venom. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her entire lavish lifestyle, her brand new cars, her luxury vacations, the very first-class ticket she just used to fly back from the Maldives, were all paid for by the interest siphoned directly from my trust fund. She was defending a fortune that legally belonged to me, and she had absolutely no idea the trap was closing entirely around them. Preston stood behind her, nodding along with her furious rant, trying to look tough while hiding behind his wife's aggressive outburst. He adjusted his expensive watch, the one bought with my stolen money, and sneered at me as if I were a peasant begging for scraps. The sheer audacity of my sister claiming I was jealous of a life built on my own stolen identity fueled the fire burning in my chest. I looked at the four of them standing together, a unified front of greed and manipulation. They had spent almost 2 decades convincing the world they were a perfect holy family, while burying me alive. They thought they could just yell and scream and make me disappear again. But they were wrong. The airport terminal felt like a courtroom, and the crowd of strangers watching us were the jury. My family had just played right into my hands, showing everyone exactly how vile and manipulative they truly were. They thought this was the end of the confrontation, but it was only the beginning. The federal marshals were still waiting in the wings, and I was ready to bring their entire empire crashing down on their heads. Preston stepped in front of his wife, puffing out his chest and aggressively adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. He looked down at me with the kind of practiced, arrogant authority that only a privileged man who thought he owned the world could muster. He placed a firm, protective hand on Giselle's shoulder and glared at me with absolute contempt. "Listen to me very carefully, Vivian," he said, his voice dropping into a low, threatening register, meant to intimidate me into silence. "I do not know what kind of mental breakdown you are experiencing right now, but you are playing a very dangerous game. You are harassing my family in a public airport and throwing around baseless accusations like a lunatic. My family has some of the most aggressive corporate lawyers in the country on retainer. If you do not turn around and walk away right this second, I will personally make sure you are sued for defamation, harassment, and extortion. We will bury you in so much legal debt you will never recover. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life paying for this little stunt." I did not shrink back. I did not drop my gaze. Instead, a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. It was the smile of a predator watching its prey step directly onto the trap. Preston had always used his race and his supposed generational wealth as a shield. He paraded around our African-American church community, acting like a benevolent aristocrat, gracing us with his presence. He loved making the congregation believe he brought old money legitimacy to the Wilson Empire. He walked through life believing he was untouchable simply because of his last name. I reached into my leather laptop bag and my fingers closed around a thick manila folder. "Is that so, Preston?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly calm and level. "You are going to use your massive family wealth to destroy me." "That is fascinating. Because according to the financial records I pulled from your personal servers, your family wealth does not actually exist." Preston's face twitched. The smug confidence in his eyes faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You are insane," he muttered, trying to dismiss me while avoiding eye contact with the gathering crowd. I pulled the folder out and flipped it open. I held up a stack of bank statements printed on crisp white paper. I decided to do a little digging into the untouchable Preston legacy. I said, my voice carrying clearly over the ambient noise of the airport terminal. "It turns out your grandfather filed for bankruptcy 12 years ago. Your precious trust fund evaporated before you even graduated college. You are completely broke, Preston. You have been broke since the day you met my sister. You married Giselle because you desperately needed access to the Wilson church money to keep up the illusion of your elite lifestyle." Giselle stopped glaring at me and turned to look at her husband. "Preston, what is she talking about?" Giselle asked, her voice tight with confusion and the first hints of panic. "Do not listen to her, Giselle." He snapped, his face turning a blotchy shade of red. "She is fabricating documents to cause drama and distract from her own pathetic life." I pulled out another stack of papers from the folder. "These are your personal credit card statements, Preston," I announced loudly. "The ones you keep routed to a private post office box in Miami so your loving wife never sees them. Should we talk about how you have been spending the church donations you siphon from my stolen interest?" I looked down at the highlighted lines on the statement. "Let us start with the luxury beachfront condo in Boca Raton, Florida. $200,000 in maintenance and furnishing fees paid over the last 18 months. And you are definitely not using it for business trips." Preston's mouth opened, but no words came out. He took a hesitant step backward, his defensive posture completely collapsing. The red blotches on his face spread down his neck as the blood drained from his cheeks. Who lives in the Boca condo? Preston, I pressed, taking a step toward him. Is it the woman named Chloe who receives a $10,000 wire transfer from your private account on the first of every single month? Or maybe it is for the massive gambling debts you have been racking up at the offshore sports books. I flipped to the next page and read the numbers aloud so everyone could hear. $50,000 lost in October, $75,000 lost in November. You are currently $300,000 in debt to private lenders in South Florida. You are bleeding my stolen trust fund dry just to keep your bookies from breaking your legs. The crowd of onlookers in the airport terminal gasped in collective shock. The security guards who had been ready to detain me just moments ago were now standing completely still, watching the wealthy facade of this family disintegrate in real time. Reginald and Corinne stared at Preston in absolute horror. Their perfect corporate son-in-law, the man they used to legitimize their shady business dealings, was being exposed as a degenerate fraud right in front of their eyes. Giselle ripped her shoulder away from Preston's hand as if his touch physically burned her skin. She stared at him with wide, horrified eyes. Her designer sunglasses slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the polished floor. Preston. Tell me she is lying, Giselle demanded, her voice rising to a hysterical pitch. Tell me you do not have a condo in Florida with another woman. Tell me you are not gambling away our money. Preston looked like a cornered animal desperately searching for an escape route that did not exist. He stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. Giselle, baby, it is not what it looks like. He pleaded, raising his hands defensively. I can explain everything. It is just an investment property. The money was for a business venture that went south. She is twisting the facts to tear us apart. I am reading your exact bank routing numbers, I stated flatly, holding the papers out toward Giselle. He has been funding a secret double life for years while you paraded him around Atlanta as the perfect loyal husband. He is a parasite who attached himself to your stolen wealth, and now he is draining it faster than you can steal it from me. The villainous alliance that had stood so strong just moments ago was instantly fractured. Giselle was no longer looking at me with hatred. All of her venom was now directed entirely at her husband. She shoved Preston hard in the chest, her manicured nails digging into the expensive fabric of his suit. You broke loser, she screamed, her voice echoing through the entire baggage claim area. You told me your family was untouchable. You told me you were managing our investments. You have been stealing from me to fund your pathetic side pieces in Florida. Preston stumbled backward, raising his arms to shield his face from his furious wife. Giselle, please calm down, he begged, looking around nervously at the dozens of people recording them on their phones. We cannot do this here. Everyone is watching us. I want them to watch, Giselle shrieked, losing all sense of her carefully cultivated church elegance. You humiliated me in front of everyone. You made a complete fool out of me. Reginald stepped between them, his face thunderous and dark with rage. He grabbed Giselle's arm and shoved Preston away with surprising force. Enough, he roared, trying to salvage some shred of his pastoral authority. We will handle this at home. We will not air our dirty laundry in a public terminal like common trash. But the damage was already done. The pristine, unified front of the Wilson family was completely shattered beyond repair. Preston stood off to the side, shrinking away from the furious glares of his wife and in-laws. He looked completely defeated, his white male privilege and unearned arrogance entirely stripped away. The illusion of his superiority was dead. I watched the chaos unfold with a profound sense of satisfaction. I had not even dropped the heaviest hammer yet, and the first massive crack in their foundation had already split them wide open. Reginald watched his golden son-in-law crumble into a pathetic, stammering mess, and he knew he was losing control of the narrative. The thick veins in his neck pulsed with barely contained fury. He turned his deep, dark glare back to me, his massive chest heaving as he realized the true magnitude of what I was holding in my hands. I was no longer the helpless runaway he could discard at will or manipulate with harsh words. I was holding the absolute destruction of his entire megachurch empire, and his pristine public image. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward me, his large frame casting a long, dark shadow over the polished airport tile. He thought he could still intimidate me with sheer physical dominance, just like he did when I was a terrified 13-year-old girl shivering in the snow. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little witch!" Reginald hissed through clenched teeth, his voice trembling with rage. "I do not care what fake papers you printed off the internet, or what lies you are trying to spin. You are coming with me right now, and we are going to fix this mess before you ruin everything I have built for this family." He lunged forward, extending his thick hands to forcefully grab my arm. He intended to dig his heavy fingers into my flesh and drag me out of the terminal, away from the prying eyes of the public and the growing crowd of nosy onlookers. He wanted to pull me outside and force me into the back of his waiting limousine, where he could strip away my confidence and break me back down into submission behind tinted glass. Before his fingers could even graze the fabric of my jacket, two tall men in dark, inconspicuous suits materialized from the crowd. They moved with a sudden, terrifying fluid precision that instantly shifted the entire atmosphere in the room. The taller man stepped directly between me and my father, raising a firm hand and pressing it hard against Reginald's chest, halting his momentum instantly. The second man flanked him smoothly, unbuttoning his suit jacket just enough to reveal the heavy black firearm holstered at his hip and the gleaming silver badge clipped to his leather belt. "Federal marshals, sir," the taller man stated, his voice radiating absolute undeniable authority. "I suggest you take a very large step back from Miss Vivian, unless you want to spend the rest of your evening in federal custody." The physical transformation of Reginald was a magnificent masterpiece to behold. The aggressive, untouchable bishop vanished in a fraction of a second. His heavy shoulders slumped, and the warm color drained rapidly from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, terrified old man. He stumbled backward, his hands shooting up in the air as if he had just touched a burning hot stove. Corinne let out a stifled gasp and covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes darting frantically between the federal agents and her husband. Giselle stood completely frozen, her anger at Preston entirely forgotten as the crushing reality of federal law enforcement crashed down upon them. They had spent 2 decades stealing millions, playing God in their megachurch, and feeling entirely invincible. Now the very real threat of federal prison was staring them right in the face. Preston tried to slowly back away into the crowd, but one of the marshals shot him a cold, warning glare that nailed his expensive loafers to the floor. The entire villainous alliance was utterly paralyzed. I stepped out from behind the marshals and walked slowly toward my father. I watched the heavy beads of sweat form on his forehead and trickle down the side of his face. He was breathing heavily, his eyes wide with a panicked, animalistic fear. I looked at the glittering Rolex on his wrist and the custom-tailored lapels of his suit. It was all bought with my blood and my stolen future. I smiled at him, a cold, calculating smile that promised absolute, unmitigated ruin. "You have a choice to make, Reginald," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level and calm, so the gathering crowd had to strain to hear me. "You have spent your entire life controlling every narrative and orchestrating every scam to protect your brand. Now I am the one holding the script. These federal marshals have a warrant for your arrest, based on 18 years of wire fraud, tax evasion, and identity theft. They have the authorization to put you and Corinne in handcuffs right here in Terminal E. They will read you your rights, while the airport patrons film you on their cell phones and call the paparazzi. Tomorrow morning, the video of the great Bishop Reginald being dragged away in chains will be broadcast on every news channel in Atlanta." Reginald swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed nervously in his throat. He looked at the armed marshals and then back at me. "What do you want, Vivian?" He rasped, his voice stripped of all its usual booming resonance. He sounded remarkably weak and defeated. "I want a front row seat to your social destruction," I replied evenly, enjoying the taste of every single word. "I want the people who worship you to see exactly what kind of monster you are behind closed doors. I know you are hosting your massive annual charity gala at the country club tonight. I know the entire congregation, the mayor, and your wealthiest donors are waiting there right now, expecting you to make a grand entrance. So here is your second option. You are going to instruct your driver to take us all to that gala. We are going to walk into that extravagant ballroom together like a happy reunited family. You are going to give me the microphone and you are going to let me tell your flock exactly where their donation money went. If you do that, I will ask the marshals to wait outside the venue and let you turn yourself in quietly. If you refuse, they arrest you right now in front of everyone. Corinne let out a quiet whimper of pure terror. She grabbed Reginald's arm, shaking her head frantically. "Reginald, we cannot go to jail like this," she sobbed, her voice cracking under the intense pressure. "Please do not let them arrest us here. Think of the church. Think of our image. We will lose everything if they see us in handcuffs." I laughed, a dry, humorless sound that cut through her pathetic sobbing. "Your image is already dead, Corinne," I said, turning my gaze to her trembling frame. "The only question is whether you want it to die here next to the baggage carousel or in front of the people you have been scamming for 2 decades. You can face the music in a luxury ballroom or in the back of a police cruiser. The choice is yours, but the outcome is exactly the same." Reginald looked around the terminal. The crowd of onlookers was growing larger by the minute. Several people had their phones out, actively recording the confrontation. He saw the whispering faces and the pointing fingers. The illusion of his supreme authority was evaporating with every passing second. He looked back at the marshals who stood perfectly still, their expressions hard and unforgiving. He was a cornered rat, trapped by his own massive ego and his desperate need to maintain his public standing at all costs. The thought of being publicly humiliated in the airport was too much for his narcissistic pride to bear. "Fine," he choked out the words, scraping against his dry throat. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a trembling hand. "Fine, Vivian. You win. We will go to the gala. We will do exactly what you want. Just tell them to back off." I nodded to the marshals. They stepped back, but remained close enough to maintain absolute control of the situation. I looked at my family standing huddled together in their expensive designer clothes, looking like frightened, vulnerable children. They had arrived expecting a victory lap, but they were leaving as my prisoners. "Pick up your own luggage," I ordered, my voice echoing with finality. "We have a party to attend." The limousine ride from the airport to the country club was the quietest journey my family had ever taken. No one spoke a single word out loud, but the silence was deafening. Reginald sat across from me, his large hands resting heavily on his knees, staring out the tinted windows into the dark Atlanta night. I could see his jaw clenching and unclenching as his mind raced, trying to calculate a way out of this nightmare. Corinne kept her head turned away entirely, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief, careful not to ruin her expensive makeup. She was practically hyperventilating. Giselle and Preston sat rigidly next to each other, putting as much physical distance between their bodies as the luxurious leather seats would allow. Preston tried once to whisper something to his wife, but Giselle shot him a look of such pure disgust that he immediately shrank back into his corner. I sat in the corner holding my leather laptop bag, resting my hand right over the hidden compartment where the flash drive and the official documents lay waiting. We pulled up to the grand entrance of the most exclusive country club in Buckhead. Valets in crisp uniforms rushed forward to open the heavy doors. The moment Reginald stepped out of the vehicle, the transformation was terrifyingly seamless. He threw his massive shoulders back, forced a brilliant wide smile onto his face, and became the charismatic bishop once again. He offered his arm to Corinne, who took a deep trembling breath and pasted on her own frozen smile. They walked up the red carpet like royalty, completely ignoring the 2 undercover federal marshals who had followed us in an unmarked black sedan and were now quietly positioning themselves by the main exits. I followed them through the heavy oak doors and into the massive ballroom. The space was breathtakingly opulent. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm golden glow over the sea of round tables covered in white silk and expensive floral centerpieces. Waiters in white coats circulated through the crowd, carrying silver trays of champagne and rare hors d'oeuvres. The room was packed with hundreds of the most influential people in the entire city. I recognized prominent African American politicians, local business moguls, celebrity athletes, and the most senior elders of our megachurch. These were the very people who funded my father's extravagant lifestyle. These were the people who wrote massive checks believing they were building community centers and funding overseas missions, while their money was actually paying for Preston's secret Florida condo and Giselle's designer wardrobe. As we walked through the crowd, people immediately flocked to Reginald. He shook hands, laughed at his booming pastoral laugh, and accepted congratulations on his successful trip. The mayor of Atlanta clapped him on the back. A prominent judge kissed Corini's cheek. My family was desperate to act as if everything was perfectly normal, but I could see the sweat gathering on Reginald's upper lip. I could see the slight tremor in Corinne's hands as she accepted a glass of champagne. They knew they were dancing on the very edge of a cliff and looking down at the jagged rocks below. Reginald made his way to the main stage at the front of the ballroom. He climbed the steps with practiced ease and walked right up to the crystal-clear acrylic podium. He tapped the microphone twice, and the low hum of conversation in the massive room instantly quieted down. The jazz band stopped playing. Hundreds of faces turned toward the bishop, waiting for his words of wisdom. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Reginald began, his voice echoing richly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "We gather tonight to celebrate the boundless grace of God and to raise funds for our new youth sanctuary. But tonight, the Lord has blessed my family with a miracle far greater than any building." He paused for dramatic effect, letting the heavy silence stretch across the room. He looked down at the crowd, and then his eyes locked directly onto me, standing near the edge of the stage. "For 19 long years, my heart has carried a heavy burden," Reginald said, his voice dropping into a register of profound, faked emotion. "Many of you know the pain of a fractured family. The devil works hard to tear us apart. But tonight the prodigal daughter has returned. My beautiful daughter Vivian has come home to us." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. People murmured in surprise and delight. Corinne closed her eyes and dramatically pressed a hand to her heart, playing the part of the overwhelmed, grateful mother to absolute perfection. Reginald was brilliant in his sickness. He was using the very crisis that was about to destroy him and spinning it into a massive fundraising opportunity. He thought if he embraced me publicly, if he trapped me in the narrative of the forgiven runaway, I would not dare cause a scene in front of the city's elite. "I want you all to open your hearts and your checkbooks tonight." Reginald continued, raising his hands toward the ceiling as if channeling the divine. "Let us celebrate this divine reunion by breaking every fundraising record we have ever set. Vivian, my sweet child, please come up here and join your father." The applause grew even louder as the spotlight swung over to illuminate me. Everyone was smiling. Everyone was watching. I looked at Reginald standing at the podium, holding his hand out to me like a benevolent savior offering redemption. He really thought he had outsmarted me. He thought the immense social pressure of this room would force me into submission, just like it always had when I was a helpless 13-year-old girl. He thought I would shrink away from the bright lights and play along to avoid ruining the evening. I did not shrink. I gripped the handles of my leather laptop bag and began walking toward the stage. The carpeted steps felt solid beneath my feet. I walked past Corinne, who was trembling so violently I thought her legs might give out at any second. I walked past Giselle, who was staring blankly at the floor, completely destroyed by her own collapsing marriage. I stepped up to the podium and stood shoulder to shoulder with the man who had thrown me into the snow. The crowd beamed up at us, completely unaware of the absolute destruction hovering right over their heads. I looked out at the hundreds of wealthy donors, at the politicians and the church elders. Then I reached into my bag and my fingers closed around the hard plastic of the flash drive. The silence in the room became absolutely unbearable as I reached for the microphone. I took the heavy silver microphone from Reginald's sweating hand. He did not want to let it go, but the crushing weight of the federal marshals waiting outside the ballroom doors forced his fingers to uncurl. The smooth metal felt cold and heavy against my palm. I turned to face the sea of expectant faces staring up at me from the candlelit tables. Hundreds of wealthy donors, influential African American politicians, business moguls, and devoted church elders were smiling, waiting for a heartwarming story of a prodigal daughter returning to the fold. I looked out over the massive, opulent room and let a soft, practiced smile touch my lips. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the pristine state of the art sound system. It is truly overwhelming to stand before you after all these years. I want to start by thanking my father, Bishop Reginald Wilson. I want to thank him for his sacrifices. I want to thank him for bringing me here tonight and for giving me this massive platform to speak the absolute truth about this family and this ministry. The crowd erupted into warm, enthusiastic applause. Several of the older women in the front row dabbed at their eyes with lace tissues, deeply moved by what they thought was a beautiful family reconciliation. Reginald stood a few feet behind me, his chest puffing out slightly as he tried to absorb the applause and regain his usual arrogant posture. He actually thought he was getting away with it. He thought my opening words meant I had surrendered to his manipulation. He thought the presence of the mayor and the city council would terrify me into playing the role of the obedient daughter. But as the applause died down, my smile vanished entirely. The warmth in my eyes completely died, replaced by a freezing clinical focus. I let a heavy, unbearable silence stretch across the massive ballroom for 10 agonizing seconds. The wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the sudden drastic drop in the temperature of the room. The joyous atmosphere evaporated instantly, replaced by a thick, suffocating tension. I turned my head slightly toward the back of the room and looked up at the elevated sound booth. I caught the eye of my lead forensic investigator, Harrison, who had slipped into the venue wearing a catering uniform an hour before we arrived. I gave him a single sharp, definitive nod. Harrison moved with lightning speed, pushing the country club technician aside and plugging his encrypted hard drive directly into the main projection system. The massive digital screens flanking the stage, which had been glowing with the elegant gold and purple logo of the Wilson Youth Sanctuary, suddenly went black. A collective gasp rippled through the audience as the screens flickered and roared back to life. The beautiful church logos were completely gone. In their place were massive, high-resolution images of dense, complex financial spreadsheets. There were copies of offshore bank transfers, routing numbers from the Cayman Islands, and highlighted ledgers showing millions of dollars moving through dozens of fake shell companies. I turned back to the microphone, my voice dropping into a register of pure, absolute ice. My father has indeed made many sacrifices. I said, the words echoing like gunshots across the silent ballroom. He sacrificed his integrity, he sacrificed his family, and most importantly to all of you sitting in this room, he sacrificed your hard-earned money to fund his own pathetic greed. Reginald lunged forward, his face twisting into a mask of pure panic and rage. "Turn those screens off," he bellowed into the empty air, waving his hands frantically at the sound booth. "We are experiencing a technical malfunction. Security, get up there and shut that down immediately." Harrison had already locked the heavy solid wood door of the sound booth from the inside. I stood my ground at the podium, projecting my voice over Reginald's panicked shouting. "Do not look away," I commanded the audience, pointing a firm finger at the massive glowing screens behind me. "What you are looking at is not a malfunction. It is a highly detailed forensic audit of the Wilson family finances over the last 19 years. I am a senior forensic accountant, and I have spent the last 3 years tracking every single penny that has moved through this church." The ballroom descended into absolute chaos. People were standing up from their tables, pointing at the screens and murmuring in shock. I did not stop. I broke down the complex financial data into simple, brutal facts that every single person in the room could understand. If you look at the red highlighted column on the left screen, you will see the donations collected for the new Community Outreach Center last year. I explained, my voice cutting through the rising panic like a razor blade. You raised $3 million for underprivileged youth. Now look at the green column on the right. That shows the exact same $3 million being transferred into a private holding company owned entirely by Corinne Wilson. That money did not buy a single book or feed a single child. It bought Corinne a fleet of luxury cars and paid for Giselle's lavish wedding in the south of France. Corinne let out a horrible choking sound and collapsed into an empty chair near the edge of the stage, hiding her face behind her designer handbag. I stepped out from behind the acrylic podium and walked to the very edge of the stage. I looked directly down into the front row, where the most senior church elders were sitting. These were the men and women who had trusted Reginald with their spiritual lives and their life savings. They were staring up at me with expressions of profound betrayal and heartbreaking devastation. "Elder Thomas," I said, looking directly into the eyes of a frail elderly man who had mortgaged his own home to support the church. "That $50,000 check you wrote last month for the overseas mission trip. It never left the state of Georgia. It went directly into an offshore account controlled by Preston to pay off his massive illegal gambling debts in Florida. I have the bank statements projected right up there to prove it." Elder Thomas gripped the edge of his table, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. The other elders began shouting, demanding answers from Reginald, who was now pacing frantically back and forth across the stage, sweating profusely and tugging at his tight silk collar. "This entire ministry is a carefully constructed scam," I continued, my voice rising in power and authority over the din of the furious crowd. "My father did not build an empire of faith. He built an empire of fraud. He legally declared me a runaway teenager 19 years ago so he could hijack my grandfather's trust fund. He stole my identity and my inheritance to buy his first mega church building. Every brick of this sanctuary is built on a foundation of theft and lies." The crowd was in an absolute uproar now. Wealthy donors were pulling out their cell phones, taking pictures of the damning spreadsheets displayed on the massive screens. Politicians were rushing toward the exits, desperate to distance themselves from the radioactive scandal that was exploding in real time. Reginald was screaming into a dead microphone that Harrison had wisely muted. I stood at the center of the stage, watching the grand charity illusion burn to the ground. The truth was finally out, and there was absolutely nowhere left for my family to hide. The murmurs of the crowd had escalated into a deafening roar of outrage, but I was not finished. I raised my free hand high into the air, and the sheer authority radiating from my posture forced the massive ballroom into a strained, breathless silence. Everyone was waiting for the final blow. I looked over at Reginald, who was frozen in place, his mouth hanging open as he realized I still held the microphone. He took a staggering step toward me, his hands outstretched in a pathetic plea for mercy, but I simply turned my back on him. I looked up at the sound booth where Harrison stood behind the reinforced glass, and I gave him the final signal. The massive digital screens behind me flickered once more. The spreadsheets of stolen charity funds vanished and were replaced by a single stark document. It was a scanned copy of a commercial real estate deed, heavily stamped and notarized. Beside it was a complex loan agreement filled with legal jargon and red highlights. I heard a collective gasp from the front row where the senior deacons were sitting. They recognized the address on the deed. It was the address of the magnificent megachurch they had all poured their life savings into building. "Look closely at the screen," I instructed the crowd, keeping my voice perfectly steady and cold. "For 10 years, my father has stood behind the pulpit and told you that your beautiful sanctuary was fully paid off. He told you that because of your generous tithes and your unwavering faith, the building belonged entirely to the congregation. That was the biggest lie of all." The screens shifted to zoom in on the signature lines. 2 years ago, Reginald secretly leveraged the entire megachurch property. He took out a massive commercial mortgage, using the very building you worship in as collateral. The silence in the ballroom shattered. People were screaming in disbelief. Elder Thomas stood up from his chair, his hands shaking so violently he knocked over his crystal water glass. "What are you saying?" he shouted, his voice cracking with age and devastation. "The church belongs to us. We paid for every single brick." "You paid for it," I answered, looking directly at the heartbroken old man. "But Reginald owns it, and he mortgaged it to the absolute limit. He took out $20 million against the property. But he did not use it to expand the ministry. He funneled every single cent into a labyrinth of offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I paced across the stage, pointing to a new graphic that Harrison displayed on the screens. It showed a flowchart of the money moving from the bank to the church and then vanishing into shell companies. "And do you know how he hid this massive theft?" I asked the crowd. "He used my name. He created a fraudulent entity called the Vivian Heritage Trust. He told the accountants and the bank auditors that the money was being secured for his poor runaway daughter. He used the tragedy of his missing child as the ultimate financial shield while he robbed his own congregation blind." The outrage that erupted from the crowd was unlike anything I had ever witnessed. It was a visceral, primal roar of absolute betrayal. Hundreds of people who had trusted this man with their souls and their wallets were now staring at him like he was the devil himself. Investors in expensive suits were shouting obscenities. Elderly women who had prayed for him daily were weeping openly and pointing accusing fingers at the stage. The deacons in the front row were physically restrained by their wives as they tried to climb the stairs to get to my father. Reginald completely lost whatever remained of his sanity. The holy, untouchable bishop evaporated, leaving behind a desperate, cornered animal. He spun around and sprinted toward the side of the stage, screaming at the top of his lungs. "Cut the feed," he bellowed, his face turning an alarming shade of purple. "Cut the microphone right now. Security, get up there and break down that door." He scrambled down the stage steps and ran wildly toward the sound booth at the back of the room. He pounded his heavy fists against the thick, locked door, screaming for Harrison to open it. Harrison just stood there behind the glass, calmly monitoring the audio levels and completely ignoring the frantic man banging on the door. The two undercover federal marshals by the exit casually stepped forward, blocking Reginald's path, preventing him from trying to find another way into the control room. Trapped and utterly exposed, Reginald rushed back to the stage. He tripped on the carpeted steps, tearing the knee of his custom-tailored suit. He scrambled to his feet and lunged at me, trying to physically tear the microphone from my hands. But I simply stepped backward out of his reach, while the speakers broadcast the sound of his heavy, panicked breathing to the entire room. "You ungrateful little brat!" Reginald screamed, his voice caught by the microphone and amplified at a deafening volume. "You think you can destroy me? I built this empire. I made all of these people who they are." The ballroom went dead silent as the congregation heard the venom in their beloved pastor's voice. Reginald did not seem to care anymore. The mask was gone. His narcissistic ego took complete control, blinding him to the fact that he was confessing his true nature to the very people he relied on. He turned to face the crowd, his eyes wide and manic. Sweat was pouring down his face, ruining his perfectly groomed appearance. "You are all nothing," he shouted at the wealthy donors and the crying deacons. "You are a bunch of gullible sheep. You handed me your money because you are weak, and you needed someone to tell you how to live. I took what was rightfully mine. I gave you hope, and you paid for it. You think a few spreadsheets are going to tear me down. I am Bishop Reginald Wilson. I am untouchable." Corinne let out a piercing wail and buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as her husband destroyed the last shred of their public dignity. Preston was trying to inch his way toward the emergency exit, leaving Giselle completely alone, but one of the federal marshals placed a firm hand on his chest, stopping him cold. I stood there holding the microphone and watched my father unravel. He was pacing the stage like a madman, continuing to hurl insults at the congregation, mocking their faith and their generosity. He was calling the mayor a fool and insulting the church elders who had stood by him for decades. Every single hateful word was being broadcast crystal clear through the speakers and recorded on hundreds of cell phones. "You did this to yourself, Reginald," I said, my voice calm and perfectly amplified over his ranting. "You built an empire on lies and you used my life as the foundation, but the foundation just crumbled." The doors at the back of the ballroom suddenly swung open. More men in dark windbreakers with the letters FBI printed across their backs entered the room, followed by local Atlanta police officers. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked outside reflected against the crystal chandeliers, casting a surreal disco ball effect over the terrified crowd. The Grand Charity Gala had officially become a crime scene. I lowered the microphone and took a deep breath. The sweet taste of absolute revenge filled my lungs. I looked at the man who had cast me out into the snow 19 years ago. He was no longer a bishop. He was no longer a powerful patriarch. He was just a pathetic, broke criminal waiting for the handcuffs to click around his wrists. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers parked outside, reflected against the crystal chandeliers, casting a surreal disco ball effect over the terrified crowd. But before the federal agents could even reach the stage, a sharp, piercing shriek echoed through the massive speakers. Corinne had scrambled up from the floor and snatched a backup wireless microphone from the jazz band's equipment stand. Her expensive designer gown was twisted, and her flawless hair was completely disheveled. The elegant, poised bishop's wife was dead. In her place stood a frantic, venomous woman whose entire universe was collapsing around her, and she was determined to take me down with it. She gripped the microphone with both hands, her knuckles turning white as she pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You ungrateful little wretch!" Corinne screamed, her voice shrill and distorted through the massive sound system. "You think you are so smart standing up there ruining everything we built? You deserved exactly what you got. You deserved to be thrown out into the freezing snow, and I would do it 1,000 times over if I had to." The entire ballroom gasped in unison. The federal agents paused their advance, letting Corinne's unhinged confession echo over the crowd. She was digging her own grave, and she was too blinded by absolute rage to even realize it. She paced across the stage, her heels digging into the carpet as she spilled the darkest secret our family had ever kept. "I hated you from the moment my father read his will," she shrieked. "My father was a stubborn old fool who never respected Reginald. He despised my husband, and he thought I was an idiot for standing by him. My father actually built his wealth with real hard work, and he called our church a pathetic grift. He hated everything about our lifestyle, so when the old man died, he did the most vindictive thing he could possibly do. He bypassed me completely, his own flesh and blood. He took the generational wealth that belonged to me, and he put every single penny of it into an ironclad trust fund exclusively for you." Corinne was hyperventilating now, her chest heaving as she spat out the decades of bitter resentment she had harbored against her own child. "You were just a stupid little girl," she sobbed furiously. "You did not know what to do with $10 million. We needed that money to build this ministry. We needed that capital to establish the church and secure our rightful place in this city. So yes, we threw you out. We declared you a rebellious runaway because once you were gone, the courts gave us emergency control over the abandoned trust. We used your grandfather's money to build our empire because it should have been ours to begin with." The absolute depravity of her confession hung in the air, sickening and heavy. The congregation members who had idolized Corinne as the ultimate mother figure were staring at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. The mayor looked visibly nauseated, turning away from the stage. Elderly church deacons were shaking their heads in horror, listening to a mother openly admit that she discarded her 13-year-old daughter to steal her inheritance. But Corinne could not stop. The toxic venom she had suppressed for 19 years was finally pouring out of her, and she wanted it to burn me. "You have always been a curse on this family," Corinne screamed, her voice cracking. "You are a parasite. You come back here waving your little papers, trying to play the victim, but you are nothing. You hear me, Vivian, you are nothing." She spun around wildly, looking at the country club security guards who were standing near the edges of the stage, completely paralyzed by the unfolding drama. "What are you idiots staring at?" Corinne demanded, stomping her foot like a petulant child. "Grab her! Throw her out of my gala! She is trespassing! I want this miserable girl thrown out onto the street right now!" None of the security guards moved a single muscle. They just looked at her as if she had lost her mind. The federal marshals stepped closer to the stage, their expressions hardened with professional contempt. Even Reginald, who was standing frozen near the sound booth, looked at his wife in stunned horror, realizing that her psychotic outburst had just handed the prosecution a recorded confession of fraud, child abandonment, and grand larceny. He had tried to spin a narrative of a reunited family, but Corinne had just taken a sledgehammer to it, broadcasting their absolute monstrous nature to every news outlet and law enforcement agency in the state. I stood completely still, letting her hateful words wash over me. For 19 years, I had wondered if there was some fundamental flaw within me that made my mother hate me so deeply. I had agonized over what I could have possibly done to deserve being cast out into the freezing night. Now I had the answer, and it was beautifully liberating. It was never about my behavior or my character. It was entirely about greed. It was about a mother so consumed by status and entitlement that she gladly traded her child for a bank account. I looked out at the disgusted faces of the crowd. The illusion of the holy bishop and the righteous first lady was completely dead. The people who had worshipped them now saw them for exactly what they were: greedy, manipulative predators who fed on the vulnerable. Corinne stood panting near the podium, the microphone slipping from her sweaty hands. She looked around the ballroom expecting someone, anyone, to come to her defense. But she was met with an impenetrable wall of absolute silence and profound revulsion. The jazz band members were staring at her with wide eyes, clutching their instruments. The wealthy donors who had written six-figure checks to her fake charities were visibly recoiling from her presence. The entire room had turned against her in a matter of minutes. Corinne finally seemed to realize the magnitude of what she had done. The manic energy drained from her body, leaving her looking small and pathetic under the bright stage lights. She took a step backward, her trembling hands flying up to cover her mouth as she looked at the federal agents closing in on the stage. The reality of federal prison was no longer a distant threat. It was walking right up the stairs to take her away. As Corinne stood trembling under the harsh glare of the stage lights, the sheer gravity of her confession settled over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. The federal agents were moving closer, their polished shoes silent on the thick carpet. It was in that moment of absolute impending doom that my perfect older sister decided to save herself. Giselle had spent her entire life riding our parents' coattails, soaking up the luxury and the privilege that came with being the golden child of a megachurch bishop. She had never lifted a finger to defend me when I was thrown out into the cold, and she had never questioned the endless flow of cash that funded her extravagant lifestyle. But now, with the very real threat of federal prison staring her right in the face, her absolute lack of loyalty was on full display. Giselle physically backed away from her mother, her face twisted in a mixture of terror and revulsion. She held her hands up defensively, as if trying to push away the radioactive scandal that was wrapping itself around our family. "I had nothing to do with this!" Giselle cried out, her voice shaking as she grabbed a microphone from the podium. She looked out at the sea of shocked faces, focusing intensely on the VIP tables, where the wealthiest women in Atlanta were sitting. I swear to God I knew absolutely nothing about a stolen trust fund or any offshore accounts. My parents kept their finances completely separate from me. I am an independent woman. I am a self-made entrepreneur. I built my luxury fashion boutique from the ground up with my own blood, sweat, and tears. I would never ever accept stolen charity money. I turned my gaze to my older sister, letting a cold, humorless smile touch my lips. Giselle was trembling violently in her custom designer gown. She was desperate to preserve her pristine status among the city's elite. She wanted them to believe she was an innocent victim of our parents' greed, so she could go back to her country club luncheons and her exclusive fashion shows. I reached into the front pocket of my leather bag and pulled out my tablet. I did not even need to signal Harrison in the sound booth this time. I simply tapped a single button on the illuminated screen in my hands. The massive digital displays behind us shifted instantly. The complex offshore routing numbers and the fake charity ledgers vanished. In their place appeared stark black and white official corporate tax returns. The elegant cursive logo of Giselle's high-end fashion boutique was displayed right at the top of the financial documents for every single person in the ballroom to see. "That is a very beautiful and inspiring story, Giselle," I said, my voice echoing relentlessly through the silent ballroom. "It is a wonderful tale about a hardworking, independent female entrepreneur building a fashion empire all on her own. But just like every single other thing in this family, your entire life is a complete and utter fabrication." I stepped closer to her, pointing a firm finger at the massive glowing screens behind me. These are the official corporate tax returns for your boutique over the last 5 years, I stated, keeping my tone perfectly clinical and detached. I want everyone in this room to look very closely at the profit margins and the cash deposit logs. The crowd leaned in, squinting at the screens. The numbers were large, highlighted in stark red and green. I watched Giselle's face drain of all its color until she looked entirely ghostly. Her hands began to shake so badly that she dropped her microphone, letting it hit the stage with a loud, painful thud. She knew exactly what I was showing the entire city. Your exclusive luxury boutique has not made a single dollar of legitimate profit since the day it opened its doors, I explained to the captivated audience, breaking down the financial reality piece by piece. You sell maybe 10 or 15 expensive dresses a month to your wealthy friends, but somehow your business makes cash deposits of hundreds of thousands of dollars every single week. You claim you are importing exclusive European fabrics, but the shipping logs show empty crates. You are not a fashion designer, Giselle. You are a professional money launderer. Giselle let out a strangled gasp. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the carpeted stage. No, she sobbed, shaking her head wildly as tears began to ruin her perfect makeup. That is not true. It is a real business. I worked so hard. My friends know how hard I worked. I did not let her breathe. I pressed forward, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. Your entire boutique is nothing but a giant washing machine for Reginald's stolen charity funds, I announced, pointing directly at our sweating father, who was now surrounded by federal marshals. You took the money he stole from this congregation, from the youth center, and from the overseas missions, and you washed it clean through fake inventory purchases and wildly inflated sales numbers. You provided the legitimate storefront to clean the dirty money, and in exchange, you got to live in a mansion and play dress-up with your rich friends. The reaction from the audience was swift and brutal. Giselle turned frantically toward the front row, where her closest friends and most elite clients were sitting. These were the women who attended her exclusive launch parties, who drank expensive champagne in her VIP lounge, and who validated her entirely fake existence. She looked at them with desperate, pleading eyes, begging them to believe her over the cold, hard numbers glowing on the screens. But they were not looking at her with sympathy. They were looking at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. Women who had kissed her cheek an hour ago were now physically turning their chairs away from the stage. They were whispering to each other, hiding their mouths behind their hands, their faces twisted in absolute revulsion. They realized in real time that they had been socializing with a criminal. They realized that every glass of champagne they drank in her boutique was paid for with money stolen from their own community and their own church. The ultimate socialite was now the ultimate pariah. "Please," Giselle whimpered, reaching her hands out toward a woman in the front row who simply looked away and crossed her arms. "Please, you have to believe me, I did not know." "Your signature is on every single fraudulent deposit slip, Giselle," I said, cutting off her pathetic pleas. "You signed the tax returns. You authorized the fake inventory purchases. You knew exactly what you were doing. You happily traded your soul for a luxury lifestyle, and you thought you would never be caught because you believed you were untouchable, just like your father." Giselle's legs finally gave out completely. She dropped heavily to her knees on the stage, the expensive fabric of her gown pooling around her. She buried her face in her hands and began weeping hysterically, her shoulders shaking with loud, ugly sobs. Her pristine, untouchable image was completely shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The golden child of the Wilson family was exposed as nothing more than a common fraud, a willing participant in the destruction of her own community. I looked down at my older sister crying on the floor, and I felt absolutely no pity. She had worn my stolen inheritance around her neck and on her fingers for 2 decades. She had traveled the world and lived a life of absolute luxury, while I worked multiple minimum wage jobs and scrubbed floors just to pay for my college textbooks. She had watched my mother throw me away, and she had smiled. Now the illusion was over. The federal marshals stepped up onto the stage, their handcuffs gleaming under the chandelier lights, ready to take the entire family away. Preston stood frozen near the edge of the stage, watching the federal marshals advance with their handcuffs gleaming under the bright chandelier lights. He looked down at his wife, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the carpeted floor. He looked back at the massive digital screens that clearly showed her luxury boutique was nothing more than a hollow money laundering front. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The bottomless well of the Wilson family wealth was completely dry. There was no secret empire left to inherit. There were only offshore accounts seized by the federal government and a heavily mortgaged megachurch that was about to be foreclosed. The handsome, supportive husband routine evaporated from Preston's face in an instant. The charming smile that had won over my parents and the gentle demeanor he used to pacify Giselle vanished entirely, leaving behind a cold, calculating sneer. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled blonde hair and let out a harsh, cruel laugh that echoed through the tense, suffocating silence of the ballroom. The wealthy donors and the disgraced church elders turned their attention toward him, unsure of what this sudden outburst meant. Even the advancing federal agents paused for a fraction of a second, sensing another explosive revelation was about to drop. Preston took a deliberate step toward Giselle and looked down at her with an expression of pure, absolute disgust. "Get up, you pathetic fraud," he snapped, his voice carrying clearly over her dramatic sobbing. "You are embarrassing yourself, and you are embarrassing me. Stop crying like a victim when you are just as guilty and broke as your criminal parents." Giselle gasped and looked up at him, her tear-streaked face twisting in absolute shock. Her heavy designer makeup was running down her cheeks, ruining her flawless complexion. She reached a shaking hand up toward him, expecting her loving husband to help her to her feet, to defend her honor against the devastating truth I had just exposed. Preston simply kicked her hand away with the tip of his polished leather shoe. "Do not touch me," Preston growled, taking another step back, as if her mere presence was somehow contaminating him. "I have spent the last 4 years playing the perfect, supportive husband to a spoiled, entitled brat who thought she was a brilliant fashion designer. I smiled and nodded while you paraded around Atlanta, pretending to be some kind of creative genius. You actually thought those wealthy women respected you. You actually thought you built a luxury brand. You are nothing but a shallow idiot who used stolen charity money to buy friends and expensive handbags." Giselle let out a strangled cry, wrapping her arms around her stomach, as her husband's vicious words destroyed whatever remained of her shattered reality. The congregation members watched in stunned silence as the perfect fairy tale marriage disintegrated right in front of them. My mother, Corinne, who was still hyperventilating near the acrylic podium, stared at her son-in-law with wide, horrified eyes. She had always bragged about Giselle's perfect marriage to a wealthy aristocratic man. She had used Preston's old money pedigree to elevate the Wilson family status in elite social circles. Now that carefully constructed illusion was burning to ashes right along with the church finances. "You thought you were using my family name to climb the social ladder," Preston yelled at Corinne, pointing a furious, accusing finger at my mother. "You thought marrying your golden child to a prestigious white family from Connecticut made you untouchable. Well, here is a massive reality check for you, Corinne. My family has been completely bankrupt for 10 years. My father's investment firm collapsed before I even met your precious daughter. The sprawling mansions, the endless trust funds, the generational wealth, it was all entirely gone. We were drowning in debt and facing absolute ruin." Preston turned back to face the entire ballroom, spreading his arms wide in a twisted, dramatic gesture of confession. "I needed cash to save my family name," he shouted to the disgusted crowd. "I needed a massive infusion of money to pay off the aggressive creditors and keep my parents out of federal prison. So I came down south and found the easiest target imaginable. A wealthy, arrogant megachurch family desperate for upper-class validation. I only married a black woman from a wealthy family because I knew you were too obsessed with image and status to ever look closely at my own financial records. You were so blinded by the prestige of having me as a son-in-law that you practically handed me the keys to the vault. The crowd watched in absolute disgust as Preston openly admitted to exploiting the racial and class dynamics of my parents' desperate social climbing. He had played them all for absolute fools, using their own vanity against them. I watched Preston pace the stage, his face flushed with desperate anger, as his grand master plan fell apart. He looked directly at me, his eyes narrowing with a toxic mixture of hatred and realization. He had done his research. He knew exactly why the charity gala was happening tonight. "Do you know how close I was?" Preston demanded, his voice rising to a frantic, desperate pitch. I played along with this ridiculous charity gala because Reginald promised me a massive payout. I was just waiting for midnight tonight. That was the deadline. At the stroke of midnight, your grandfather's trust fund was scheduled to fully transfer into the fraudulent corporate accounts Corinne and Reginald set up. $50 million! Preston screamed, the massive number echoing like a gunshot through the silent room. $50 million of clean, untraceable generational wealth was going to drop right into the joint accounts I shared with Giselle. I suffered through 4 years of your insufferable family for that money. I smiled at your fake church services and attended your pathetic charity dinners, just waiting for the clock to strike 12. Tomorrow morning, I was going to drain every single penny of that $50 million into a private offshore account. I already had the divorce papers drawn up and waiting on my lawyer's desk. I was going to leave this spoiled fraud completely penniless and disappear back to the East Coast. Giselle let out a horrific, gut-wrenching scream and collapsed fully onto the floor, completely broken by the absolute depth of his betrayal. The man she loved had only ever seen her as a walking bank account, and he was fully prepared to destroy her life the very next morning. The wealthy donors and politicians in the crowd watched in absolute revulsion as the final layer of the Wilson family perfection rotted away. There was no loyalty left among the thieves. Preston had flipped sides the moment the money vanished, revealing himself to be just as monstrous and greedy as the people he had married into. The federal marshals finally moved forward, their patience entirely exhausted, as they closed the circle around the burning wreckage of my family. Giselle let out a primal scream that tore through the heavy silence of the ballroom. She did not stay on the floor for long. The devastating realization that her entire marriage was a calculated financial transaction completely shattered her fragile, pampered mind. She scrambled to her feet, her expensive designer heels slipping on the polished wood of the stage. She launched herself directly at Preston's face. She swung her arms wildly, her manicured nails aiming for his eyes. Preston stumbled backward in genuine shock as Giselle collided with his chest. She was tearing at his custom-tailored jacket, ripping the expensive silk fabric, and screaming that she was going to kill him. "You used me!" she shrieked, her voice breaking into a hysterical pitch. "You parasitic liar, you used my family!" She slapped him across the face with a loud, sharp crack that echoed through the microphone still lying on the floor. Preston recovered his balance and forcefully shoved Giselle away. She stumbled and fell hard against the acrylic podium, sending it crashing to the side. "Are you crazy?" Preston yelled, wiping a smear of blood from his cheek where her diamond ring had caught his skin. "You are just as much of a parasite as I am Giselle. You just got caught." Reginald, who had been standing paralyzed by the absolute destruction of his legacy, suddenly snapped. Seeing this bankrupt East Coast aristocrat publicly humiliate his golden child triggered the last remaining shred of his massive ego. He let out a furious roar and charged across the stage. Reginald was a heavy, imposing man, and he hit Preston with the force of a runaway freight train. The two men crashed to the floor, sending a row of decorative floral arrangements tumbling off the edge of the stage and onto the VIP tables below. "I will kill you!" Reginald bellowed, his hands wrapping around Preston's throat. "I took you in and I let you marry my daughter, you bankrupt piece of trash." Preston thrashed wildly, throwing a desperate punch that landed squarely on Reginald's jaw. The holy bishop staggered back, spitting blood onto the stage, but quickly recovered and threw himself back onto his son-in-law. They were rolling on the ground, exchanging brutal, uncoordinated blows. The immaculate silk suits they wore to project divine wealth and authority were being torn to shreds. Corinne was completely ignoring the violent brawl happening just feet away from her. She was still on her knees near the center of the stage, frantically clutching the ripped fabric of her ruined designer gown. She was rocking back and forth, muttering incoherently about her gala, her social standing, and her country club memberships. "My dress," she wailed, staring blankly at the torn silk in her hands. "My beautiful life. You ruined my beautiful life." She looked up at the ceiling and began screaming, a high-pitched, continuous sound of pure psychological collapse. The entire ballroom was on its feet. The wealthy Atlanta elite, the influential politicians, and the devoted church elders were watching this grotesque spectacle with absolute horror and undisguised fascination. Cell phones were raised in the air, recording every single second of the Wilson family tearing each other to pieces. The grand illusion of faith and perfection was entirely gone, replaced by a violent, greedy pack of animals fighting over scraps. The mayor was actively shielding his wife as broken flowers and pieces of the shattered podium rolled off the stage. The senior deacons, who had revered Reginald as a spiritual giant, were openly weeping at the pathetic sight of their bishop rolling on the floor in a bloody fistfight with his own son-in-law. I stood completely still at the very edge of the stage. I did not flinch. I did not intervene. I simply watched the beautiful chaos unfold. For 18 agonizing years, these people had systematically tried to destroy my mind. They had thrown me out into the freezing winter, telling me I was nothing. They had told the world I was a troubled runaway. They had stolen my identity, my grandfather's love, and my inheritance to build their twisted empire of lies. They had spent decades psychologically torturing me, trying to convince me that I was worthless and that they were chosen by God. Now I was watching them execute that exact same violence upon each other. The masks were entirely gone. Reginald was bleeding and cursing like a street thug. Preston was fighting like a cornered rat. Giselle was screaming on the floor, her flawless beauty twisted into an ugly mask of pure hatred. Corinne had completely lost her grip on reality, mourning a dress while her family imploded around her. They were doing my work for me. They were destroying themselves with far more cruelty than I ever could have inflicted upon them. It was the most magnificent poetic justice I could have ever imagined. I did not feel a single ounce of pity or guilt. Every blow they landed on each other was a direct result of their own unchecked greed. They had built a massive house of cards on a foundation of theft and betrayal, and now that the wind had finally blown, it was collapsing directly on their heads. They had spent their entire lives pretending to be better than everyone else in this room, but their true nature was finally exposed to the harsh light of reality. The federal marshals and the local police officers finally broke their perimeter. They surged up the stairs of the stage, moving with swift, practiced efficiency to end the pathetic brawl. Two massive agents grabbed Reginald by the shoulders, hauling him off of Preston and slamming him face down onto the carpeted stage. "Stop resisting," one of the agents barked, forcing Reginald's arms behind his back with a loud metallic click of handcuffs. Another team of officers hauled Preston to his feet. His nose was bleeding heavily and his expensive shirt was torn open. He tried to straighten his posture, tried to assert some last pathetic remnant of his aristocratic privilege, but the officers simply pushed him against the wall and cuffed him tightly. Giselle was sobbing uncontrollably as a female officer gently but firmly pulled her up by her arms and secured her wrists. Corinne did not even fight back. When the agents reached her, she simply held her wrists out, still staring blankly at the crowd, her mind completely shattered by the public humiliation. I watched as my father, my mother, my sister, and my brother-in-law were paraded across the stage in federal restraints. They looked so small and so utterly defeated. Reginald locked eyes with me as they dragged him past the broken podium. There was no rage left in his eyes, only a hollow, desperate realization that he had lost absolutely everything. I did not smile. I did not say a word. I just looked back at him with the freezing clinical detachment of an investigator who had successfully closed a long overdue case. The heavy brass doors of the ballroom slammed shut behind the last federal agent, leaving the stage completely empty except for me. The sudden absence of my screaming family left a ringing silence in the massive room. The wealthy donors, the disgraced politicians, and the heartbroken church elders were all standing in a state of absolute shock. Nobody moved and nobody spoke. They were all staring at the empty space where the powerful Bishop Reginald Wilson had just been violently dragged away in handcuffs. Then a deep, resonant sound broke the heavy, suffocating silence. The massive antique grandfather clock standing in the grand foyer just outside the open ballroom doors began to chime. The rich metallic gong echoed through the room, marking the exact passing of the hour. 1, 2, 3. I stood at the edge of the shattered stage and counted the chimes, letting the sound vibrate through my chest. 12 deep, resounding gongs echoing like a final judge, bringing down a heavy wooden gavel. It was exactly midnight. I was officially 32 years old. I looked toward the back of the room and saw Harrison emerging from the sound booth. He walked down the center aisle, moving with a calm, deliberate pace that contrasted sharply with the chaotic violence that had just taken place. In his hands, he carried a thick black leather binder filled with certified legal documents. The crowd parted silently for him, watching as he climbed the few remaining intact steps onto the stage. He stopped beside me and handed me the binder before picking up the backup microphone from the floor. He dusted off the metal grate and tapped it twice to ensure it was still broadcasting clearly to the massive room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Harrison began, his voice projecting with smooth professional authority. "As the lead forensic investigator on this case, I have one final piece of information to share with you tonight. As of exactly midnight, Vivian Wilson has turned 32 years old. By reaching this specific milestone, she has officially and legally fulfilled every single requirement stipulated in the original trust established by her late grandfather." Harrison opened the binder in my hands and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it up for the front row to see. "The $50 million generational wealth fund that Reginald, Corinne, and Preston were conspiring to steal tomorrow morning is no longer in limbo," Harrison announced, his words cutting through the tense air. "The automated banking protocols we established with the federal authorities activated exactly 60 seconds ago. The $50 million is now fully vested and permanently locked in Vivian's name alone. There is no backdoor access and there are no loopholes. The money is entirely hers and completely untouchable by anyone else." A low murmur rippled through the remaining crowd. The sheer amount of money was staggering, but the absolute finality of the transfer was what truly stunned them. Preston had spent 4 years playing a devoted husband, just waiting for this exact minute to arrive. Corinne had abandoned her own daughter to gain control of this specific fortune. Reginald had built a house of cards on the assumption that he could eventually drain these funds. They had all been counting down to midnight, but they had spent the final hour destroying each other while the money slipped right through their fingers. "But there is another critical detail you all need to understand," Harrison continued, raising his hand to quiet the murmurs. "When Reginald Wilson took out the $20 million commercial mortgage on the megachurch property, he needed massive collateral to secure the loan. He could not use his own assets because they were all built on fraudulent shell companies. So he used the one thing that had absolute, undeniable value. He used the Vivian Heritage Trust as the sole collateral for his entire real estate portfolio." The church elders in the front row gasped, their eyes widening as they began to comprehend the massive legal trap Reginald had blindly walked into. Harrison nodded, looking directly at the devastated deacons. Reginald believed that because he legally controlled the trust as a guardian, he could leverage it indefinitely. He assumed he would drain the funds before the bank ever called in the debt. But Reginald committed federal bank fraud, and his loans are now in immediate default. Because the $50 million trust is the securing collateral, and because that trust is now fully vested and controlled exclusively by Vivian, the legal chain of ownership has automatically triggered. I took the microphone from Harrison's hand. I looked out over the sea of faces, my expression perfectly calm and deeply resolved. "Reginald thought he was a brilliant businessman," I said, my voice steady and clear. "He thought using my name to secure his empire was a clever loophole. But what he actually did was sign away everything he ever valued. By defaulting on the fraudulent loans secured by my trust, the bank is forced to surrender the collateral assets directly to the trust holder to satisfy the debt. I paused, letting the absolute reality of the situation sink into the minds of every single person in the room. I do not just have my grandfather's $50 million, I announced. I am now the sole legal owner of the megachurch sanctuary you worship in. I own the community center. I own the massive mansion in Buckhead where Corinne was planning to host her victory brunch tomorrow. I own the luxury vehicles, the offshore holding companies, and every single piece of commercial real estate Reginald ever put his name on. The ballroom fell into a silence so profound you could hear the distant sirens fading into the Atlanta night. The sheer magnitude of my total victory was almost impossible to process. The grand, untouchable empire that Reginald had spent 2 decades building through theft, manipulation, and religious extortion had just been entirely legally swallowed whole by the daughter he threw away. He had literally handed me the keys to his entire kingdom. Elder Thomas leaned heavily on the table, staring up at me with an expression of pure awe and lingering heartbreak. "What will happen to the church, Vivian?" he asked, his voice trembling with years of misplaced devotion. "What will happen to us?" I looked at the frail old man who had been lied to for so long, and I let a genuine smile touch my face. "Every single legitimate donation that was stolen from this congregation will be audited and returned," I promised. "The fraudulent charities will be dismantled completely. The mega-church building will be sold, and the proceeds will be placed into a transparent community fund, managed by an independent board of directors. Reginald built a monument to his own ego, but I am going to tear it down and give the foundation back to the people he robbed." A slow, hesitant applause began in the back of the room. It was not the fake enthusiastic cheering that had greeted me at the beginning of the night. It was a genuine, deeply emotional applause from people who had just been freed from a massive psychological and financial prison. The applause spread through the ballroom, growing louder and more resonant as the congregation finally understood that the nightmare was truly over. I stood on the stage, holding the documents that proved I owned the empire that tried to destroy me, completely at peace with the beautiful ashes they left behind. The federal marshals were holding my family near the heavy brass doors of the ballroom, preparing to march them out into the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers waiting outside. I stepped down from the stage, the wooden stairs creaking softly beneath my shoes. The entire room remained completely silent, watching my every move as I walked slowly down the center aisle. I held the heavy black leather binder Harrison had given me against my chest. Every step I took felt lighter than the last, as the suffocating weight of the past 18 years finally lifted off my shoulders. I stopped right in front of Reginald. The marshals tightened their grip on his arms but allowed me to stand face to face with the man who had stolen my childhood and my future. His breathing was heavy and ragged. Blood was still drying on his chin from where Preston had struck him. He looked like a broken, pathetic old man stripped of his expensive tailored suit jacket and his booming, arrogant voice. I opened the black binder and pulled out a thick, crisp white document. I held it out and carefully tucked it into the front breast pocket of his ruined shirt, since his hands were cuffed behind his back. "That is a formal 24-hour eviction notice, Reginald," I said, my voice echoing clearly in the silent foyer. "By tomorrow at exactly midnight, you and your wife are legally required to vacate the Buckhead mansion. But since you are both going to be sitting in a federal holding cell, I will make sure the marshals understand that your belongings will be placed on the curb. Although there will not be much to pack because you do not actually own anything inside that massive house." Reginald stared at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot, but he could not speak. He knew the absolute finality of my words. He knew there were no more tricks to play. The custom-imported furniture, the expensive modern art, the massive crystal chandeliers. I continued breaking down his entire existence, piece by piece. All of it was purchased using lines of credit secured by my trust fund. That means my corporation is now the sole legal owner of every single item in that sprawling estate. The luxury imported cars you drive are registered to a shell company that I now possess. You are not allowed to take the vehicles. You are not allowed to take the art. You are not allowed to take the silver or the antiques. You are not allowed to take anything except the clothes currently on your backs. Corinne let out a weak, pathetic whimper from where she was standing next to him. She was trembling violently, her ruined designer gown hanging off her shoulders. She looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing that her entire identity as a wealthy, untouchable socialite had just evaporated into thin air. She had spent her whole life curating an image of absolute perfection, and it was all gone. "That includes your jewelry collection, Corinne," I said, turning my cold gaze toward her. "The diamond necklaces, the emerald rings, the custom tennis bracelets you love to flaunt at your exclusive luncheons. They were all bought with stolen money washed through my inheritance. They stay in the house. If you try to hide even a single pair of earrings, my lawyers will add grand larceny to your already massive list of federal charges. You are walking out of here tonight with absolutely nothing. You are going to be just as destitute as you made me when you threw me out into the street." I then turned my attention to Giselle, who was slumped against the wall, crying so heavily she was choking on her own breath. She looked up at me, her face a ruined mask of running makeup in pure despair. Her husband had abandoned her, and her empire was fake. "As the new controlling owner of the Wilson corporate portfolio, I am making some immediate restructuring decisions," I announced, looking down at my older sister. "Giselle, you are officially terminated from your position as creative director of your luxury fashion boutique, effective immediately. You are also fired from your role as executive vice president of the family holding company. You are stripped of all corporate titles, all access to company credit cards, and all operational authority. Your business accounts have already been frozen, and your access codes have been revoked. You do not even own the designer shoes on your feet, or the business cards in your purse." "No," Giselle sobbed, shaking her head wildly and trying to pull away from the officer holding her. "Please, Vivian, please do not do this. I have nothing left. Preston took everything. Please. You never had anything to begin with," I replied, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You built your entire pathetic life on a foundation of theft, and you happily danced on my grave to do it. You watched them abuse me and you smiled. You deserve every single ounce of nothing that you have right now." I took a step back, looking at the four of them. They were no longer the powerful elite rulers of Atlanta. They were just four broken criminals waiting to be hauled away to prison. But there was one last piece of reality they needed to understand before they left. I looked around the magnificent ballroom of the exclusive country club. The crystal chandeliers were glowing brightly, and the gold leaf detailing on the walls shimmered in the light. "You all thought you were so clever renting out this elite private club for your charity gala," I said, sweeping my hand toward the grand architecture around us. "You thought standing in this room validated your status among the wealthy and powerful. You thought you belonged here, but you failed to read the fine print when you signed the rental agreement. This country club was purchased 3 months ago by a private equity firm, a firm that is wholly owned by the Vivian Heritage Trust." Reginald's head snapped up his jaw, dropping open in absolute disbelief. The church elders and politicians still standing in the background gasped collectively at the sheer scale of my trap. "That is right, Reginald," I said, a cold, hard smile finally touching my lips. "You are currently standing in my building. The ground beneath your feet belongs to me. The roof over your head belongs to me. Every single thing you thought made you special actually belongs to the daughter you threw away like trash. You are officially trespassing on my private property, and I want you gone." I looked at the lead federal marshal and gave him a single sharp nod. The agent nodded back and began moving my family toward the heavy glass exit doors. Corinne started wailing again, a loud, ugly sound of complete despair as the cold night air hit her face. Reginald stumbled, his head bowed in absolute total defeat. Giselle was practically dragged out her legs, failing to support her weight. Preston followed silently, staring blankly into the distance. They were marched out into the blinding glare of the police lights, their dignity, their wealth, and their freedom entirely stripped away in one sweeping motion. I stood in the doorway of my country club and watched the police cruisers drive away, carrying the ashes of the Wilson family into the dark. The heavy brass doors of the banquet hall suddenly burst completely open, shattering the momentary silence that had fallen over the room. A massive wave of federal marshals and FBI agents swarmed into the space, their dark tactical gear a sharp contrast to the elegant crystalline silk of the country club. They marched straight down the center aisle, moving with absolute coordinated precision as they surrounded the stage. The wealthy elite of Atlanta shrank back into the shadows of the room, terrified of being caught in the crossfire of this massive federal raid. The lead FBI agent stepped onto the stage holding a thick stack of official arrest warrants. He did not care about the ruined designer gowns or the shattered acrylic podium. He only cared about executing the law. Reginald Wilson. The agent announced, his voice booming through the silent ballroom, without the need for a microphone. You are under arrest for grand larceny and multiple counts of wire fraud. You have systematically defrauded hundreds of individuals and charities, and you will face the full weight of the federal justice system. Reginald let out a guttural sob as the agents forcefully jerked his arms backward, locking the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. He looked completely broken, his holy facade stripped away to reveal the cowardly thief underneath. Corinne was still weeping on the floor, clutching the torn fabric of her dress, when two female agents hauled her to her feet. Corinne Wilson, you are under arrest for identity theft and falsifying public records, the agent stated firmly. Completely ignoring my mother's hysterical crying. You stole your own daughter's identity to secure fraudulent loans, and you will be held fully accountable. Corinne did not even try to fight back. She simply let her head fall forward, her pristine socialite image completely destroyed in front of the very women she had spent decades trying to impress. The agents then moved to Preston, who was already bleeding from his fight with Reginald. Preston Blackwood, you are under arrest for interstate money laundering and conspiracy to commit fraud, the lead agent declared, snapping another pair of handcuffs over his wrists. You knowingly participated in a criminal enterprise to wash stolen funds across state lines. Preston's arrogant, aristocratic face contorted with panic. He tried to speak, tried to explain that he was just waiting for the midnight transfer, that he was a victim of the Wilsons, but the agent simply pushed his head down and read him his rights. Giselle watched her entire world disintegrate, her husband and her parents branded as federal criminals. She was sobbing so violently she could barely stand as the agent secured her wrists and read her rights regarding corporate fraud and tax evasion. It was in that moment of absolute total ruin that Reginald finally broke. The proud, arrogant bishop who had commanded tens of thousands of followers suddenly dropped heavily to his knees on the carpeted stage. He ignored the federal agents holding his arms and dragged himself forward until he was kneeling directly at my feet. The entire ballroom watched in stunned silence as the powerful patriarch of the Wilson family wept like a desperate child. "Vivian, please!" Reginald begged, his voice cracking as tears streamed down his bruised and bleeding face. "Please, you have to stop this. You have the money now. You have the power. You can call off the lawyers and tell the bank to drop the charges. Please, Vivian, we are your family. We share the same blood. You cannot just stand there and watch your own flesh and blood go to federal prison. Have mercy on us, Vivian. Please have mercy. I am your father. I gave you life. You owe us family loyalty." I stood completely still, looking down at the pathetic, broken man kneeling before me. I looked at the tears streaming down his face and the desperate begging in his eyes. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no sorrow, no lingering attachment. I slowly crouched down until my face was just inches from his. I looked directly into his terrified eyes and I let a cold, dead smile touch my lips. I leaned in close so that only he could hear my final devastating words. "I do not owe you anything," I whispered, my voice entirely devoid of emotion. You are just a stray dog begging for scraps, and I do not let stray dogs sleep in my house." Reginald's eyes widened in absolute horror as he recognized the exact words he had screamed at me 19 years ago. The exact words he had used when he dragged a crying 13-year-old girl to the front door and threw her out into the freezing snow. He realized in that agonizing second that I had never forgotten a single thing. I had carried those words with me for nearly 2 decades, waiting for the perfect moment to hand them back. He let out a loud, agonizing wail of pure despair as the federal marshals finally hauled him to his feet and dragged him away from me. The resolution of the night was swift and brutal. The federal agents marched my disgraced family through the center aisle of the country club. The elite community of Atlanta did not offer them any sympathy. Instead, the wealthy donors and influential politicians pulled out their cell phones, filming the humiliating spectacle. They recorded every single second of Reginald, Corinne, Giselle, and Preston being shoved out the brass doors and into the cold night air. The flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminated the country club walls, painting the faces of my family in a stark, unforgiving glare. The very people who had kissed their cheeks and praised their divine leadership just hours ago were now actively laughing and whispering about their downfall. The elite social circles had completely ostracized them before they even reached the police cars. Their names would be scrubbed from every charity board, and their pictures would be burned. The Wilson family was entirely erased from the world of the wealthy and powerful. I stood at the edge of the stage and watched the cruisers pull away into the darkness, carrying my abusers to the federal holding cells where they belonged. The next morning, the sun rose over the city with a brilliant, blinding light. The air was crisp and clean, washing away the heavy, suffocating toxicity of the previous night. I drove my car through the quiet, wrought iron gates of the historic cemetery. The lush green grass was still wet with morning dew, and the massive oak trees provided a gentle, peaceful shade. I walked slowly down the stone path until I reached the grand marble headstone of my grandfather. I stood in the warm sunshine, completely and utterly unburdened. The heavy, invisible chains that had wrapped around my chest for 18 years were finally broken. I took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill my lungs. I had done it. I had protected the legacy he left behind, and I had brought absolute justice to the people who tried to destroy it. I reached out and gently placed a single white rose on the cool marble surface of his grave. I did not need to say anything aloud. He knew I had won. I turned away from the grave and walked back toward my car. The keys to the entire empire were sitting in my pocket. The $50 million trust fund, the sprawling commercial real estate portfolio, the Buckhead Mansion, and the country club all belonged to me. I had successfully executed the most brilliant strategic revenge and emerged completely victorious. I opened the door of my luxury car and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine, listening to the quiet, powerful hum of the motor. I looked at myself in the rear-view mirror, seeing a strong, independent 32-year-old woman who had finally claimed her rightful place in the world. I put the car in gear and drove out of the cemetery, ready to manage my new massive empire. I finally had the profound peace, the immense wealth, and the absolute justice that I had earned. The ultimate sweet revenge was completely finished. The most powerful lesson to take away from this story today is that true security and self-worth can never be determined by the people who consistently fail to value you. When a toxic family tries to break your spirit and define you as a failure, you always have the power to rewrite your own narrative. Authentic success is not about seeking revenge through anger, but about reclaiming your independence and building a life so unshakably successful that their negativity can no longer touch you. The best justice is simply choosing yourself and thriving entirely on your own terms forever. If you have ever had to walk away from toxic relatives to protect your peace, please share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more empowering journeys.